There's a tree line behind my family's place that I don't walk into after dark anymore. Not since last October. Not since I started hearing my name called from somewhere past the first row of pines, in a voice that gets the shape of it almost right and not quite. I want to tell you why. I want to tell you about my grandfather, a letter that showed up at his door with no return address, and a well out past an old logging town called Barrow's Mill that I am asking you, sincerely, never to go looking for. I'm not going to lie to you and pretend I believed any of this 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I thought my grandfather's one strange habit was just a thing old men do. Now I sleep with the hallway light on, and I want you to understand exactly why before I get to the part where it stops making sense. My grandfather died 2 winters ago, out on the same farm he'd lived on his whole life, 40 minutes past where the blacktop turns to gravel in the bush country north of the lake. He was a quiet man, steady, the kind of man who fixed his own fences and never raised his voice. And the only strange thing about him, the only thing anybody in the family ever really talked about, was that he would not sleep in a dark house. Not once, not in 81 years. There was always a lamp burning somewhere. The hallway, the kitchen, the porch. My grandmother used to joke that he was afraid of the dark like a little boy, and he'd laugh along with it, and change the subject, and make sure the lamp got refilled with oil before he went to bed. Cleaning out the farmhouse after the funeral, my dad and I found a metal box at the very back of the attic, behind 40 years of Christmas decorations nobody used anymore. Inside was a photograph of a young man none of us recognized, and a letter, badly yellowed, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. No name on the envelope, no return address, just a postmark from a town we couldn't find on any map, and my grandfather's name written in handwriting that wasn't his. My dad remembered it. He said my grandfather got that letter when he was 19 years old, showed up on the porch with no explanation, and that Grandpa read it once, alone, and never mentioned it again to a single soul until my dad was about my age, and Grandpa finally told him the story, the way you'd confess to something. My dad said Grandpa made him swear not to go looking for the place in the letter. He said it like he meant it. I did not swear anything. I sat down in that attic with the light fading through the one small window, and I read the whole thing myself. The letter was written by a young man, and he never gave his name. He said he was writing to whoever ended up with it, because he needed someone, somewhere, to know what happened to him, and to not make the mistake he made. He said he'd been restless that year, 20 years old and sick of his own life, working a job he didn't care about in a city that felt too small, even though it wasn't. So one weekend he just drove. No plan. He took back roads north until the radio stopped picking up anything but static. And when his truck started running rough on a stretch of gravel with no name on it, he pulled into the first place he saw, which turned out to be an old logging town called Barrow's Mill. He said the town looked wrong the second he saw it, though it took him a while to say exactly why. The houses were the kind of big and old that towns like that don't usually have anymore. Roofs gone black with age, windows boarded over, everything under a layer of dust and moss like the whole place had been sealed under glass for 50 years. No power lines, no satellite dishes, no trucks newer than his grandfather would have driven. He said walking down that main street felt like driving through a town that time had agreed, collectively, to stop moving through. The general store's door hung half open, swinging slightly on its hinge, though there wasn't a breath of wind that afternoon. A little church stood at the end of the street with the cross gone from the steeple, just a bare iron stub where it used to be. An old flatbed truck sat rusted into the weeds behind the store, grass grown up thick through the engine block, tires rotted flat. He said there wasn't a single bird sound the whole time he walked that street. Not one. He hadn't noticed silence like that before. the kind you can actually feel pressing on your ears. There were people, old women mostly, sitting on porches in little clusters, and they stopped talking the second he came into view. One of them made the sign of the cross at him, like he was something to be warded off rather than a stranger who needed directions. He noticed strips of red cloth tied to almost every door handle in town, bundles of dried herbs pushed into the dirt under windowsills. He told himself it was just some old-timer superstition. He said in the letter that he understood later that it wasn't. He tried asking a couple of the women on the porches how far it was to the next town, whether there was a bus through, anything. They answered him, but strangely, like the question itself made them uncomfortable. One told him the bus used to run but didn't anymore, hadn't in years, though she couldn't say when it stopped. Another just said, "There's no need to rush off, dear," like leaving quickly was somehow the wrong instinct to have. He said he laughed it off at the time, chalked it up to small-town oddness, the kind of thing you'd find anywhere far enough off the highway. He wrote that he wished, now, he'd paid closer attention to how careful they'd all been, not to actually answer him. His truck wouldn't start again that evening, and with no cell signal, and no idea how far the next town even was, he knocked on the first door that looked lived in. An older woman answered. He called her Grandma Ann in the letter, said that was what she told him to call her, though he never learned if that was actually her name or just what she went by. She had to be past 70, but her eyes were sharp, alert in a way that didn't match the rest of her. She wouldn't take money for a room. Said she'd rather he help around the property instead. Chores, fence work, hauling water from the well behind her house. He agreed, mostly because he didn't have another option, and she set him up in a small room upstairs with a squeaky cot and a table, and that was where he stayed. He wrote that the days moved strangely there. Slower than they should have. He'd work through a task and look up and somehow it'd be evening. No memory of the hours between. Grandma Ann fed him, worked alongside him, muttered something under her breath, while she worked that wasn't quite English, and wasn't quite prayer either. Every night before bed, she'd walk a full circle around the house and knock 3 times on the doorframe with her knuckles. He asked her once why she did that. Most mornings started the same way. Up before light, coffee boiled black on the stove, then out to the fence line or the wood pile, while the frost was still thick on the grass. He said Grandma Ann worked harder than he did most days, never seeming to tire, and never once complaining, though she'd go quiet for long stretches, watching the tree line the way you'd watch a road for a car you were expecting. In the afternoons, if the chores were done, she'd send him into what passed for the general store to see if anything had come in on the truck, though he said in 3 weeks he never once saw a delivery truck actually arrive. The shelves stayed the same, canned goods with labels faded past reading, a freezer that hummed but never seemed to open. He asked her once why she circled the house every night, knocking 3 times on the doorframe. She said, "So it doesn't get in." And she wouldn't say another word about it no matter how he pushed. He didn't sleep well in that house. Most nights, he'd hear slow, dragging footsteps along the outside wall, pausing right under his window, like something was listening to see if he was awake. He'd look in the morning and find footprints pressed into the frost under the glass. Bare feet, by the shape of them. Too small to be a grown man's, too deliberate to be an animal's. He never once saw a dog anywhere in that entire town, and he told himself that's what the prints were from anyway, because the alternative wasn't something he wanted to sit with. There was an ordinary well behind Grandma Ann's house, too, one he hauled water from most mornings as part of his chores, and he was careful in the letter to say that one never bothered him. Good stone, clean rope, a bucket worn smooth from decades of use. One evening over supper, plain stew and bread, she caught him looking out the window toward the tree line and told him, without him asking, that her own mother had taught her the business with the door frame, the 3 knocks, when she was a girl no older than 10. He asked her if she believed it actually worked. She said belief didn't come into it. She said some things you do whether you believe in them or not, because the cost of being wrong is a lot higher than the cost of looking foolish. Then she told him, quiet, not looking up from her plate, that not everything out past the tree line was dangerous, and not everything that looked safe in the daylight actually was. He asked her what she meant. She didn't answer that one either. During the day he wandered. The bush around Barrow's mill was thick, gray-green even at noon, and it swallowed sound the way heavy snow does. On his 3rd or 4th day out there, he found an old homestead sitting alone, on a rise in the trees, roof caved in, windows boarded, the whole place leaning like it wanted to lie down. And beside it, half swallowed by moss, sat a well. He said the wooden cover over it had rotted through and fallen part way in, and when he leaned over the stone lip and looked down, the water was perfectly still. Mirror still. Which struck him as wrong immediately, because everything else about that homestead was falling apart, choked with weeds and collapse, and yet this water sat there undisturbed, like nothing had touched its surface in 100 years. He said there was a shimmer to it he couldn't explain, not a reflection of the sky. Something moving just under the stillness. He said he circled the homestead itself before he worked up the nerve to leave. Through a broken pane in the front window, he could make out furniture still standing inside. A table, 2 chairs, a shape that might have been a stove, everything buried under decades of dust, like a room nobody had had the chance to finish leaving. An axe head, rusted solid, was sunk into an old stump by the back step, the handle long since rotted away. There was a child's boot lying in the weeds near the door, cracked and gray with age. Just the one. No sign of its match anywhere close by. He said none of it looked abandoned in the ordinary, gradual way old places usually do. It looked like everyone inside had simply stopped, mid-motion, and never started again. Back in town, he asked Grandma Ann and a couple of the old women on the porches about the homestead. They went quiet the way people go quiet around a subject they've agreed never to bring up. One of them, hunched and weathered like old bark, finally told him. She called it the Whitcombe place, said the man who lived there had been a killer, a thief, someone the whole valley used to be afraid of, and that whatever he'd done out there had left something behind in that well. Its power still lives there, she told him. Don't go back to that place, he said in the letter that he meant to listen. He really did. But something about that well had already gotten its hooks into him, and over the next several days, he found himself walking back out to the Whitcombe place, again and again, standing at the edge of that water, trying to understand what he was even looking at. One gray, fogged-in morning, half convinced the whole thing was nonsense, he decided to test it. He made a wish, something small and stupid just to see. Nothing happened. He tried again with something that actually mattered to him. Still nothing. He remembered laughing at himself, kneeling in the dirt in front of an old hole in the ground, like it was a wishing fountain from a fairground. That was when the old man found him. He introduced himself as Stan, one of the only men left in that town, deeply lined, bent with age, and his eyes were sharp the same way Grandma Ann's had been. Stan asked what he was doing out there, and when he explained, Stan gave a short, humorless laugh. That well doesn't grant wishes, Stan told him. Its power runs the other way. To feel it, you have to do something genuinely bad. That's what feeds it. It's been waiting a long time to be fed again. He asked Stan how he knew. Stan told him someone in his own family had believed the same thing once, gone out to that well with the same idea, and that person was still out there somewhere. Not dead. not alive either. Just caught between the two, is how Stan put it. Then he said the thing that the letter writer said he should have listened to. "Don't come back here again," Stan told him. "Not until you've done something you can't take back." Meaning, don't come back at all. He said in the letter that he nodded like he agreed. And the second Stan disappeared back into the trees, he found he couldn't think about anything else. Stan's warning sat in his head like a splinter, and instead of pulling it out, he found himself turning it over and over, working it deeper. He tried for a few days to just be normal about it. He did his chores. He helped Grandma Ann mend a stretch of fence along the tree line, and didn't once let himself look toward the Whitcombe place while he worked. He told himself he'd wait out his truck repairs and leave Barrow's mill behind for good. Forget the whole thing, the well included. But his sleep got worse, not better. He'd wake in the small hours with Stan's voice still going in his head, something truly bad, and lie there turning the phrase over until the room went gray with morning. On the third day, he caught himself standing at the tree line without remembering walking there, just staring off toward the rise where the homestead sat. And that was when he understood he wasn't going to leave it alone. 3 nights later, without fully deciding to, he took the small icon that hung above Grandma Ann's door, the one thing in that whole house that seemed to matter to her, and he carried it out into the dark toward the Whitcombe place, because some part of him had decided he needed to know, for certain, what that well actually was. He said the walk out felt different that night. The trees seemed to lean closer than they had before, and the woods were full of small sounds, rustling, a kind of low murmur just under hearing that never quite resolved into words. About halfway there, he heard footsteps behind him, heavy, matching his pace exactly. He turned and there was nothing, just shadows shifting where the wind moved the branches. He walked faster. The footsteps kept up. Gray shapes seemed to flicker between the trunks at the edge of his vision, gone the instant he looked straight at them. He ran the last stretch and came out into the clearing gasping, and he went straight to the well and looked down into it. There was a face at the bottom, staring back up at him out of the dark water. Gray, shrunken, like something mummified. The eye sockets were empty, streaming a kind of darkness that wasn't quite smoke and wasn't quite liquid. The mouth hung open on broken, uneven teeth. Where the nose should have been, there was only a black hollow, and it did not blink. It did not move at all, except that somehow, impossibly, it seemed to be looking directly at him. He said his first thought, absurdly, was that it was some kind of reflection, a trick of the water and the dark, and he almost laughed with relief at the idea. But reflections move when you move. He tilted his head. The face in the water didn't tilt with him. He leaned back an inch. It stayed exactly where it was, exactly as it had been, watching him from a stillness no reflection could hold. That was the moment the relief went out of him all at once, like a door slamming somewhere far off in a house he didn't know he was standing in. He said he couldn't look away. It was like the face had a physical grip on his eyes. His heart was slamming. The forest had gone dead silent around him, and all he could hear was his own blood in his ears. And then it hit him, the way the worst realizations always seem to arrive too late to matter. It wasn't a stranger's face down there. It was his own. He understood, kneeling there in the dirt with the stolen icon still clutched in his hand, that the theft, the obsession, whatever had been growing in him since Stan's warning, had already changed something. He'd become exactly what those old women had been afraid of. He said he was still on his knees when the whisper came up out of the water. Not a voice exactly. Toneless. Flat. Like something reciting words it had said 1,000 times before and would say 1,000 times again. You broke the rule. Now you belong to me. He ran. The forest didn't let him run in a straight line, though. Every path folded back into another one, branches clawing at his face and arms, the ground uneven enough that he went down hard more than once and lost track of how long he lay there. Once, scrambling back up, he was certain he'd found the trail he'd come in on. Packed dirt underfoot, familiar shapes ahead in the dark, and he ran that way, with something like relief starting in his chest. Right up until the trail simply stopped at a wall of thorn brush that hadn't been there on the way in, as if the path had led him somewhere on purpose, and then closed the door behind him. He tore his hands getting back out of it. When he finally got his feet back under him again, he was standing at the edge of a different clearing. A second well sat at the center of it, stones smooth where the first one had been mossy, and the water inside was black and thick, moving like oil. He said that was when he understood the woods themselves were working against him. Even his own shadow seemed to fall the wrong direction. He ran again, blind, until finally the trees opened up and he was back on the edge of Barrow's mill. Except it wasn't the town he'd left. The houses stood boarded and sagging like they'd been empty for decades instead of days. He went straight to Grandma Ann's door and pounded on it, again and again, until his knuckles split. When it finally opened, it wasn't her standing there. It was the thing from the well, wearing the shape of a doorway, looking at him with those same empty sockets. He said the whole world seemed to come apart after that. The house went. The town went. And then he was simply alone, somewhere without a name, in the kind of dark that doesn't end when the sun comes up. The rest of the letter was harder to follow. He said the days blurred together after that, no way to count them, everyone identical to the last. He never left the small hut he found himself in. Food appeared without him seeing who brought it, though it never tasted like anything. There were no mirrors anywhere, and he said he was grateful for that, because he was afraid of what he'd see if he looked. Sometimes he heard voices behind the wall, low, like people talking in the next room, except there was no next room. When he called out, the voices stopped instantly, and the silence after was worse than the sound had been. Once, out at the edge of the hut, in whatever passed for evening out there, he thought he saw a shape moving between two trees at a distance, the way he'd seen the old man Stan move that first time. He called out, some cousin of Hope in it, thinking maybe he wasn't as alone as he'd assumed. The shape stopped, and, for a long moment, simply stood there facing him without coming any closer and without answering. Then it turned and went back into the dark, the way it had come. He remembered what Stan had told him at the well, about a family member of his own who'd believed the same thing once, and who was still out there somewhere, neither dead nor alive. He wondered, writing it down, whether that was who he'd seen. He wondered if that was who he was going to become to whoever came after him. He found, somewhere in that stretch of blurred, identical days, a stub of pencil and a few loose pages tucked in a drawer of the hut's one table. And he started writing this letter without any real plan for who would read it or how it would ever leave that place. He said doing it was the only thing that made the days feel like they belonged to him at all. The only proof he had that he was still a person keeping track of something, rather than just another shape the forest had gotten hold of. He tried once to just walk out of the woods in a straight line, all day, sun at his back the whole way. By evening, he was standing in the exact spot he'd started from. The forest wouldn't let him go. It kept reshaping itself around him, closing every path he tried, and he understood, finally, that he wasn't going to leave. His letter ended with this. He said the person reading it was his last chance to warn somebody, since he had no way left to warn anyone himself. Don't repeat my mistake, he wrote. Don't listen to what the woods are whispering. And if you ever find yourself standing over a well like that one, for God's sake, don't look inside. You don't know what's going to look back. I sat in that attic a long time after I finished reading. Long enough that the light through the window went from gray to nothing. My dad told me, once I came downstairs with the letter still in my hand, that he used to think it was just an old, scary story, something Grandpa had heard as a kid and half believed. But he said the older he got, the more he noticed the woods around our own property starting to feel different at night. Heavier. He started having dreams about walking unfamiliar paths in the dark, with something following just out of sight. He didn't know, until we found that box, that the letter itself had survived. He'd assumed Grandpa burned it years ago. There was still the matter of the photograph, the young man none of us recognized, and I couldn't let that go either. I spent an evening on the Historical Society's website for the county, and then on the phone with a woman there who sounded delighted someone young was finally interested in the old logging records. There was no Barrow's mill on any map she had, current or historical, though she said that didn't mean much. Half those camps never made it onto anything official before they folded. What she did find, after some digging, was a newspaper clipping from decades back. A missing person notice. A young man last seen leaving the city on a weekend drive north with no stated destination. The photograph in the clipping she emailed me was grainy, newsprint gone soft with age. It was the same face from the box in our attic. I checked it against the photograph 3 separate times before I let myself believe it. He was never found. The file, as far as the Historical Society knew, was still technically open. For a while after the funeral, I told myself the same thing my dad must have told himself for years, that it was just a story, an old family superstition passed down with a scary letter attached to make it stick. I went back to my life. I didn't think about Barrow's mill, or the well, or the light in the hallway that my grandfather used to leave burning every single night of his adult life, for reasons nobody had understood until now. Then the woods behind our own place started doing things I can't explain away anymore. It started small. A rustling from deep in the tree line at night that sounded less like wind and more like a lot of quiet voices overlapping, none of them clear enough to make out words. I told myself it was just branches. Then I started seeing shapes out there after dark, standing between the trunks, not moving exactly, but swaying, the way something sways when there's no wind to explain it. One night, I walked out toward the tree line myself, just to prove to myself I was imagining it. There was a shape standing between 2 pines, about 30 yards in. It didn't run. It didn't come toward me either. It just stood there swaying, and I made myself turn around and walk back to the house without looking over my shoulder, even though every part of me wanted to look. I started having the same dream, over and over, walking a dark path through heavy trees, a well ahead of me that I somehow recognize, even though I've never seen it, and a whisper rising up out of it, calling my name. Not quite my name. Close enough that I answer to it in the dream every time, right before I wake up. Up in the attic, on the same chest that box had come out of, I found long scratches gouged into the wood. Deep. Fresh-looking. The attic door had been locked the whole time. I tried once to get proof of something, anything, that I could point to and say, "Look, I'm not imagining this." I stood on the back step with my phone and filmed the tree line for almost a full minute. Nothing happening the whole time I was watching it live. When I played it back inside, there were 11 seconds near the end where the picture wasn't the yard at all. Just dark, close up, out of focus, like the lens had been an inch from something for those 11 seconds and then wasn't. I checked the timestamp against what I remembered filming. I hadn't moved the phone. I haven't tried filming out there since. A few weeks ago, I found a small burlap bundle tied with string sitting on our porch step. Inside were 3 dry twigs, bound in a cross and a pinch of ash. I figured it was from Linda, our closest neighbor, an older widow who's lived 2 properties down since before I was born. I walked over to ask her about it and found her standing dead still in her yard, staring at the tree line behind our house, not blinking. When I said her name, she didn't turn around. She just said, quiet, like she was talking to herself more than to me. Not yet. Let it wait. I never got anything else out of her, and I haven't asked again. 2 days after that, Linda called the house phone, which she'd never once done in all the years I've known her. When I picked up, there was no voice on the other end, just breathing, slow and even, for maybe 10 seconds, and then the line went dead. I called her back immediately. She answered normal as anything, said she hadn't called me at all, hadn't been near her phone in an hour. I didn't push it. I've started to understand that some questions around here don't get real answers, and asking them twice just makes people look at you the way Linda looked at the tree line that day. The tree line feels closer than it used to. What used to be open field behind our garden is thick with young growth now, the kind that shouldn't have come up that fast in one season. Every night I lock the doors and pull the curtains, and every night the whispering out there gets a little louder, a little harder to talk myself out of hearing. 2 nights ago, something tapped on my bedroom window. Slow, even, like it was counting. I lay there and counted along without meaning to, and it stopped partway through, mid-count, for no reason I could find. In the morning, there was nothing outside that could have made the sound, just footprints in the frost, leading from the tree line up to the house, not away from it, toward it. I've stopped telling my dad the details. He knows the broad strokes, knows I've been having a hard time sleeping, and I think some part of him understands exactly why without either of us saying it out loud. Last week, I caught him standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, just standing there in the dark, not reaching for the light switch, and when he saw me, he said, "Quiet. You're hearing it too, aren't you?" I didn't have to answer. We stood there a minute, the 2 of us, not saying anything else, and then he went back to bed, and so did I, and neither one of us turned a single light on to do it. Some nights, when the house has gone quiet and everyone else is asleep, I think I can hear something out past that tree line calling my name, the same patient way it must have called to that young man in the letter. All those years before he ever knew to be afraid of it. I haven't answered yet. I think about him sometimes. That young man in the photograph, decades younger than my grandfather ever got to be, still out there somewhere past a tree line that doesn't show up on any map, writing pages by hand in a hut with no mirrors, hoping a stranger he'd never meet would someday read his handwriting and believe him. I think about how long you'd have to sit with that kind of waiting before you stopped being able to tell whether it was hope or just habit keeping you going. I think about it more than I probably should, given everything else going on outside our own back windows lately. My grandfather kept a lamp burning every night of his life, and for years I thought that was just a habit, an old man's quirk, something a little sad and a little sweet. I used to do the same thing myself, out of respect for him more than anything. A light in the hallway every night, just in case. I don't anymore. Because somewhere along the way I started to notice that the nights the whispering gets loudest, the nights the shape in the trees stands closest to the edge of the yard, are always the nights I've left a light burning somewhere in the house. I don't know for certain what's out past our tree line. I don't know if it's the same thing that took that young man's face for its own 80 years ago, or something older still, or something that's simply learned, over all that time, exactly what draws people out to the edge of the dark to look. But I've stopped leaving a light on to keep it away. Now I leave the house dark every night, and I lie very still, and I listen for whether it's still looking for me. So far, in the dark, It hasn't found me yet.